Welcome. The purpose of this recorded assessment guide is to introduce you to the module assessment through clear explanation of the requirements. This guide contains a number of sections. We'll firstly give an overview of the module assessment as a whole in terms of the structure of the assessment through the module. We'll then introduce each portfolio part in detail, explaining requirements and, importantly, taking a look at the intended learning outcomes and assessment criteria related to each part. Finally, we'll discuss common pitfalls in the module and how to avoid them. The assessment in this module is split into two parts, with each part handed in at different stages. The submission dates for each part can be found within the module handbook. It'd be good to add those dates to your calendar in advance so you can try to plan time to complete each part. The first part, Portfolio Part 1, is 1,000 words and asks you to write a statement about your role as a teaching practitioner, drawing on your own personal reflection and external literature. This first part accounts for 20% of your module marks. Portfolio Part 2 is 5,000 words and asks you to use a case study from your practice or to select one of the given case studies on the VLE, although it's much easier to reflect on your own practice. You should write a detailed critical analysis of your teaching and learning approach. You should draw on scholarship, research and reflection to provide comments on classroom management, diversity in learning and using technology to support learning. Let's have a look at both of these two submissions in a little bit more detail. So let's look at part 1 in a bit more detail. As mentioned earlier, you're expected to write a statement about your role as a teaching practitioner, drawing on your own personal reflection and external literature. It's a maximum of 1,000 words, so you can't go over. And this part relates to intended learning outcomes 1 and 7, and as we said, is 20% of your portfolio mark. ILOs 1 and 7 are to compare and contrast the opportunities and challenges of your learning and teaching context, and to critically integrate appropriate scholarship, research and reflection in learning and teaching. We'll look at these alongside the criteria in a moment. There's no set structure to this 1,000 words. The only thing to bear in mind is that you must be hitting these intended learning outcomes within whatever structure you choose. There's no one right way to do it. As it's a reflective critique, you're also welcome to write in first person if you wish. The draft submission in this case is compulsory. Your drafts will be peer reviewed. You'll read and feedback on 2 draft submissions, and your draft submission will also get the feedback from 2 peers. This is a really valuable way to use peer review, and I've been part of this process in a previous course. We'll give you some guidelines on giving peer feedback nearer the time. Don't worry if you don't have a full draft by the stated draft deadline. You can just submit an outline structure of your draft if you wish. However, having a rough draft is a valuable thing to have, as you'll get more useful feedback from peers rather than just handing in a structure. You may be wondering, well, what if I'm not a teaching practitioner in the traditional sense? Or what if I've only just started teaching, so don't have much to look back on? We understand that the PGCLT has students from many parts of the university, support services, as well as in schools. It doesn't matter if you fall into this category, you'll still have plenty to reflect upon. You can define what your role is with the students and can critically reflect on those interactions. If you're new, then you can reflect on your previous learning experiences and can still compare and contrast the opportunities and challenges of your learning and teaching context. Don't forget, whatever background or job role, you must include critical discussion using the literature to ensure that you pass ILO 7. Finally, self-assessment. As you may have already seen in the appendix of the handbook, you're provided with a self-assessment template for each portfolio element. You should complete the self-assessment and add it to the appendix of your final submission for each part. Let's take a look at the template and criteria for part 1. This is the marking rubric for Part 1. I've edited it to allow you to self-assess against the criteria. It's this template that you'll use and add it to the appendix for your Part 1 submission. The template is available in the handbook. As it says, you should highlight the rubric to show where and to what level you feel you've met the criteria. You should then use the final column to explain why and how you feel you've met it to that level. This is a really valuable process, not just for you, but for you to try with your own students too. It ensures that you're aware of the criteria and have engaged with it to make sure you're hitting each of the learning outcomes. It also gives you a chance to plug any gaps where you feel you're not hitting the higher marks where you want to. I'd suggest doing this at least a few days in advance so you do have the chance to make changes where necessary. But you should engage with the criteria throughout the writing process. ILO 1 is clearly related to comparing and contrasting the opportunities in your teaching context. The threshold for a pass is 50%, with a minimum for a pass being some clear comparing and contrasting of opportunities and challenges, and importantly, related to your context and your practice. ILO 7 is related to the critical integration of the literature into your discussion and reflections on your role as a teaching practitioner. The threshold pass here is to include some literature from outside the prescribed readings, and importantly, to carefully build this literature into your own reflections on your role. If we move on now then to Portfolio Part 2. For this part, you're expected to use a case study from your practice. You should write a detailed critical analysis of your teaching and learning approach. This should draw on scholarship, research and reflection and provide comments on classroom management, diversity and learning and using technology to support learning. If you struggle for a case study, then you can select one of the given case studies on the VLE, although it's much easier to reflect on your own practice. You should agree a case study in advance with your PAT before starting to write. This is a maximum of 5,000 words and is covered by all the intended learning outcomes, and it makes up 80% of your portfolio mark for this module. The suggested structure and the intended learning outcomes and criteria are covered on the following slides. For this part, you're required to reflect on and critically review an aspect of your practice in the form of a case study, as we said. This could involve designing, planning and evaluating learning activities that may range from something very specific, such as a particular lecture or seminar or workshops, to the consideration of a series of interconnected activities, for example, a series of lectures or seminars that you teach. It may be a whole module. You may consider how you teach and support learning, how you assess and give feedback to learners, or how you develop effective learning environments and approaches, and importantly, how your students learn within their specific environments. You may also review activities such as supervising students on dissertations or placements. Any of these can be a case study. The choice of the case study is very flexible. It's important you evaluate whether the use of technology could enhance the practice you're critically reviewing within your case study. The submission should have a focus on your chosen case study or aspect of teaching, which should clearly be articulated at the start of your report. Critical analysis of the literature, methods and approaches should relate it back to your own practice where possible throughout the report. There should be clear critical analysis of your own practice using the literature. The draft submission for this is optional, but we hope that your experience in the draft feedback of Part 1 and engagement with others through the peer review will demonstrate the value of the draft submission for peer review, which will encourage you to submit a draft for this part too. As with Part 1, the self-assessment rubric is available in the module handbook and is shown on the following slides. These are the intended learning outcomes for Part 2. Within this report, you should cover the following ILOs. Firstly, compare and contrast the opportunities and challenges of your learning and teaching context. ILO 2, critically reflect on the different student learning approaches. Here, you should use the literature to show how students learn and relate this to what you do in the case study context, or would like to do based on what you've read, with some critique on practice. ILO 3 is to critically analyse appropriate teaching strategies for your context. Again, this should relate to the chosen case study and the literature on specific teaching strategies. Number 4, evaluate the use of technology to support your students' learning. So how may technology improve learning in the student experience within your context? Does it already? Why might this change based on what you've read, and so on? Importantly, again, relating it back to the case study that you've chosen. ILO 5 is to critically compare and contrast the different needs of learners within your teaching context. We'll cover this a little bit more on the following slide. Number 6 is to analyse and evaluate diversity and internationalisation of student learning within your context. Diversity here is relating to students with protective characteristics, and so on, and any type of internationalisation where you may have international students, again related to the case study. So it's diversity with the students that you're dealing with, so diversity in related to protected characteristics, and internationalisation in related to the international students that you have within your context. If you don't have any, you can just discuss this and why it might be the case. Intended Learning Outcome 7 will be covered if you are critically integrating appropriate scholarship when critically evaluating the elements mentioned above. Where ILOs specifically require critical discussion, you should ensure you critically integrate appropriate scholarship, research and reflection, especially in relation to the chosen case study. Let's have a look at a suggested structure now for the report. This is only an indicative structure, and your own case study might lend itself to a different structure, which is absolutely fine. However, if you choose a different structure, please ensure you are covering all the ILOs. You should have a clear introduction and conclusion to the report. The suggested sections are shown here to ensure you are covering all the necessary ILOs. Firstly, you should identify the case study that you're using and explain it. As part of this, you should compare and contrast the opportunities and challenges of the learning and teaching context within your case study. Next section would see you critically reflect on the different student learning approaches within your case study, using the literature to aid your critical reflection and discussion on different student learning approaches. Next, you'll critically analyse appropriate teaching strategies for your chosen case studies. Again, using the literature to aid your critical discussion and reflection on identified appropriate teaching strategies. So the difference between the previous section is you're reflecting on how students learn, and this section is you're reflecting on how you're teaching and the different strategies for teaching. Section 5 in this list is to evaluate the use of technology to support your students' learning within your case study and context. For example, could technology be used to enhance student learning within this case study? Do you already use technology within this case study that enhances student learning? What might you try in future and why? Section 6 is to critically compare and contrast the different needs of learners within your learning and teaching context of your case study. For example, this might be students with additional learning needs, with caring responsibilities, from different socio-economic backgrounds, students who are first in family to university, and so on, or many different things that can create issues for students within your context. Importantly, it should discuss whatever is relevant to your case study and context. You should use the literature to aid your critical reflection and discussion on the different student learning needs within your context. Finally, you must analyse and evaluate diversity and internationalisation of student learning in your context. This is diversity in terms of students with protective characteristics, for example, and internationalisation in terms of the international students you have within your cohorts in the case studies that we're talking about. You'll then conclude your report, add your bibliography and your appendices. The appendices in this case will be your self-assessment and a copy of your completed observation of teaching document. We'll talk a bit more about observation in a moment. Again, you do not need to follow this structure if you don't want to. The key thing is to keep relating each part of your report back to your context and the chosen case study, and making sure that you're hitting those ILOs. As with part 1, you'll self-assess using this template and attach it into your part 2 submission in the appendix. Take the time to read this criteria and make sure you now feel you understand what you need to do to pass. Again, a pass is at 50%. This slide covers ILOs 1 to 3. This slide shows ILOs 4 to 7. This template is over 2 slides here just because it didn't fit on one, but the handbook it's there in one piece for you to use as a template for your submission. Again, take time to read the criteria and always aim for the distinction category if you can. That way, if you fall a little short, you're still there within the pass criteria. Let's take a little look at observation of teaching now. As stated in the handbook, you must be observed teaching at least once during the PGCLT to gain fellowship. Although we recommend twice across the course if you can, because it's really good for reflection purposes to look back on your first observation compared to your second one in the second module. We'd like you to be observed within Module A. However, if you have any issues in arranging an observation, please let me know. You should start to arrange this observation now, right at the start of the module, to ensure that you can get it in on time. Your mentor or another senior colleague will observe you teaching, training others in practice. You must use the standard observation templates used by your schools and university. We have a copy on the VLE, but you may use your school's version if it's slightly different. You should add your completed observation form to the appendices of Part 2. So whilst we've covered each part of the portfolio within this guide, and hopefully we'll cover everything you need to know, it's useful to point out the common pitfalls within the module. There are key things that others have done that have prevented positive outcomes in the past, so we'll cover here what they are. First of all, not asking at the start when you're unsure of what is expected with any aspect of the assessment. Questions are good. We like questions. Please use the discussion, use the PGCLT at BPP email address. If you're unsure about any aspect of the assessment, then post the questions within the induction week discussion around module handbook content. The second issue is not referring back to the criteria when writing your portfolio submissions. We do use the criteria and the rubric to mark your work, so it's important that you're engaging with it. We hopefully ensure engagement through asking you to self-assess within each element. This is a great thing to also ask your own students to do. Third issue is lack of critical discussion and analysis. This is a level 7 qualification. As such, you're required to include critical discussion and analysis. See the learning outcomes, you'll see the word critical in there. This is the quickest way to be referred in an intended learning outcome if you don't include critique and critical discussion using the literature. Finally, not engaging with the weekly writing and reading puts you at a major disadvantage. This will build up the foundations for your submission and minimise the work you have to do at the submission points. Don't worry if there's a particularly busy week at work where you can't catch up with something. It will all be there, and there are no synchronous sessions that you'll miss. It's all asynchronous, recorded, and there for you to catch up with when you're ready. But do try to do something, schedule in something weekly, as will help you to keep up. Some key points regarding the assessment, kind of standard questions that we usually get. It's worth pointing out these before they trip you up at the end. The PGCLT is a validated Level 7 programme and it's accredited by Advanced HE, sometimes called the HEA. As such, it follows standard BPP assessment regulations. The policy for extensions is now 5 days maximum for those on part-time courses, so please bear that in mind. Extension requests must be submitted before the assessment due date, and non-submission means a mark of 0 for that part of the portfolio. Resubmissions are capped at 50%. You can request interruption of studies, mostly referred to as IOS, when things get a bit difficult and you want to defer to the next iteration of the module. That's absolutely fine. We understand that sometimes things don't go to plan. Submissions for all parts of the portfolio are all online through the Dropbox on Moodle. Submissions should all include a front cover with your name and student number on there. And finally, submissions should all include your self-assessment rubric in the appendix. Thank you for listening to this assessment guide. Please ensure that you're happy with the requirements for the portfolio elements set out within this guide, and if not, or if you have any further questions, then please email pgclt@bpp.com. Thanks for listening.